This is Richard Harris. I'm your Director of Sales Training and Consulting at SalesHacker. So if you ever need anything, by all means, give us a call. We're happy to help you. Before we jump into introductions, just a couple of housekeeping issues. One, we're obviously going to record the session. It'll be available for downloads later, available for viewing, or if you need to jump to another call or you want someone else in your organization to listen to it, which I think in this case that will probably happen. If you've never been on a SalesHacker webinar before, we love questions. We love you to ask questions while we're in the middle of the session. So feel free to go into the question box and ask a question, and we'll ask live and in the moment. Our goal is to make sure that the questions that come up are relevant to the conversation that's occurring. Yes, we'll do Q&A at the end, but so many times, the question you wanted to ask is now 30 minutes later than when you thought about it, so it's not as exciting or relevant, and we don't like that to happen. We want to make this fun. Also, please go into the chat box, introduce yourself, tell us your title, tell us the name of your company, tell us how many reps you're managing, tell us, your biggest challenges around forecasting. Just something, let's make this an interactive process as opposed to just a listening process. So we're very excited for this. Let's go ahead and get into our introduction. So I want to introduce from SalesTing, Piyush Saggi. And Piyush, I hope I said your last name correctly. I apologize.
No, you did. That's
great.
That was exactly how it is.
Excellent. Well, let me give a little bit of an introduction. So Piyush left the world of Microsoft as a sales leader trying to solve this one problem. And I'm going to let him sort of tell the story of what happened. But he grew up in India, went to the U.S. for school and graduate degrees, went to sell at Microsoft. He became the first person to sell the cloud version of Microsoft in 2009. And so I believe is that Azure? Is that what you were selling, Piyush?
It was the precursor to what is now known as Office 365.
Got it. Okay, so it's that precursor. And then he had to leave in 2015, not because he wasn't doing well, but because he was so frustrated with pipelines and what was going on. So what we're going to do in a minute is, before we get into the Q&A in the presentation, I am going to ask Piyush to talk a little bit about what SalesTing does, not from the perspective of a pitch, but very specifically so you understand the context for where our conversation's coming from and the context from which Piyush built this organization to begin with based on his frustrations with the pipeline. So if you're joining us now, I promise this is not a sales pitch. This is us getting greater context for the rest of the conversation. So Piyush, welcome so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who's on the webinar with us today. I appreciate your time in advance. You're spending an hour of your life with us. Very brief introduction to SalesTing is we're a pipeline analytics software company with a twist. And the twist is that one of my frustrations as an enterprise seller for almost a decade at the world's largest software company was the fact that the way pipeline management and reviews were happening, it was just very, very frustrating to me. And I realized early on that the solution to solving the problem is not just in building software. So the twist in what we are doing is we've kind of incorporated a lot of learnings from the world of behavioral economics into what we are doing. And that's kind of given us insights into a lot of data and research we've been able to do in the past almost 2 years, some of which I'll share with you today during the course of the webinar.
Great. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and maybe get started on everything. And I think, obviously the first question that we ask in these webinars is, why are we talking about this? Why are we doing this today?
So the biggest pain that I have seen and experienced, and this isn't a hypothetical story, I actually did leave and resign from my job because of this problem. There's this friction between the three stakeholders who are so deeply involved with pipeline management. Sellers on one end of this three-dimensional space, sales management and operations, which is the other dimension of this space, and then marketing, which is the third dimension. I felt there's so much headache and so much heartache associated with pipeline management at B2B companies that, that we have to do this, we have to look at it differently and do something about it. The other reality of life that we've seen after talking to a few hundreds of companies has been that if you ask the question, where is our pipeline energy being spent? Everything that we are doing as stakeholders to influence the pipeline, that's what I call the pipeline energy. The goal is to be on the right side of this spectrum, but in reality, most companies are on the very left side of the spectrum. I was spending probably a good 40% of my own time on internal meetings, review calls, repeating the same stuff 7 times and having 4 different versions of the same spreadsheet just to review and manage the pipeline.
So let me ask you a question. Just out of curiosity for the sake of the audience, how big was the team you were managing?
So I was part of a team that was about a dozen people, the Southeast team. That's what I was a member of.
Okay. Got it. And so you were still just having, 40% of your time, and I know you sort of said, well, it was sort of one-on-ones and 4 spreadsheets. Tell us more about that spreadsheet. I really want people to understand what the pains are around all of this.
So essentially, I'll quickly answer that and talk about what's the underlying root cause there. Mm-hmm. So the symptoms were we were spending 40% of the time on these review meetings, and in a lot of companies, there's a matrix organization. And folks, I apologize. This is the Dilbert's Law fire alarm going on in the building. It could not have happened.
It wouldn't be fun if something like this didn't happen. It's all right. I think we've all been there, and you know what? Just keep going.
Right. So I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed, but let's keep going. And so the symptoms were that, we were a matrix organization. I was part of a matrix organization, and basically I had to torture the data till it somehow confessed in one manager or the other. And
torture the data,
that's
right?
Really what we were doing.
Right.
Different people, they wanted different answers from the same set of data, same set of spreadsheets in all sorts of different formats. But these were all symptoms. Mm-hmm. I think the root causes, which is where I want to direct your attention and talk about 2 primary ones, which I feel are very, very significant. And at the same time, you can do something about it. I don't want to talk about hypotheticals that no one can act on. And so there are these 2 root causes, I feel, that come in the way of effective pipeline management. Mm-hmm. And one of these is information asymmetry, and the other one is the simple fact that rewiring human beings just does not work.
Right. So talk about that for a second, because I know when we talked about it, let's define the sort of information asymmetry. That was, for me, that was a very complex thing to grasp, and I was sort of, explain that a little bit more for me, and maybe for some other folks.
Sure. So in the simplest of terms, information asymmetry basically refers to the fact that every hop between you as a stakeholder and your customer reduces the quality of information that you have by about 50%. And so if you look at it visually, I have a kind of exponentially decaying graph at the bottom. Mm-hmm. I have a few graduate degrees, so I have to kind of use some of these fancy graphs. That if a customer knows, let's say, 100 points about the reality of life, by the time this information gets to the sales rep, it has already decayed by half. By the time it comes to the sales manager, another half is lost. By the time it comes to sales operations and the VP of management, another half is lost, and mm-hmm. then marketing, as we all know, typically is at the receiving end of all this as well. And so this is what I call information asymmetry, that different people have access to different quality and quantity of information, and this is one of the root causes of all the heartache and headache we have associated with pipeline management.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. So that's one of the 2 root causes. What's the other one? Let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about where we go from there.
So the other one is this observation that rewiring human beings just doesn't seem to work. And let me explain a little what I mean by that. In the world of enterprise sales where CRM systems have been around for almost a decade now, and a lot of companies, a lot of management in particular, because they want to address this problem of information asymmetry, they want more data and information, they want to be closer to the actual deal status and such, they keep introducing more and more software and tools to the sales team. And the problem with all this is that it's very difficult to rewire the human being and ask sellers to just start doing things differently simply to serve the need of management to get access to more information. And that's what has typically been happening. And as a seller, means it's happened to me as well, where, hey, Piyush, now instead of doing something that took 1 click, you now have to do something that will take 7 clicks just to solve the information asymmetry problem for your management.
Right.
And
so basically you're saying that my strategy of, the beatings will continue until morale improves when it comes to CRM engagement is no longer valid? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I just think that that's not the right area to spend our energies on.
Agreed.
And we have spent so much time over these past 10, 15 years that the evidence is there that it hasn't worked.
Yep. It totally is a square peg in a round hole. So, all right, so we've determined out these 2 root causes, this information asymmetry and for lack of a better word, the habits of the people. Now what? What do you do? Okay, great. You solved my problem. How do I fix it? What can I do to get better?
So let's segue into what I wanted to talk about today in terms of this 3-step process, if you will, which begins with step 1 is identifying what I call your minimum viable data set. And I'm hoping that the question that you have in mind right now is, well, what the heck is this minimum viable data set?
Mm-hmm.
At a very high level, a minimum viable data set for pipeline management is a data set that has these 2 properties. It requires the least amount of effort, and it provides the most reliable view of your pipeline. Let me explain a little more about this minimum viable data set, because this is very likely the single most important takeaway for our webinar attendees today. Is to think of your pipeline, think of the data associated with pipeline management from this perspective of a minimum viable data set. So most companies, the sales teams, they typically have several different tools that they are already using. And a minimum viable data set basically is identifying the 2 or 3 most important tools that the sales team is already using, but these are very likely siloed, and connecting these together to arrive at a minimum data set that will give you the most accurate picture of your pipeline without resorting to the beatings and lynchings of the sales team that we put forward in the CRM system.
So back up 1 second, right? So we have these tools, right? They could be everything from, I don't know, SalesLoft to Outreach to Chorus or Gong or, all these other sales tools. And that data's there. And so what you're saying is we want to take this data, pull it out of each individual silo, run some AI around it, or at least, just some keyword analysis, and figure out what's really happening. Is that, and based upon a certain amount of data, you can start to figure out where your deals are closing or where they're stalling. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, very much so. And essentially, the CRM system, I think for the audacious sales leaders who are attending the call today, maybe you should go to your office and tell salespeople, hey, I don't care about what you enter into the CRM system anymore. I'm not going to beat you up on that anymore, because we're now going to look at the other silos, which up till now have basically been locked. It's not that we're not using these other sales tools like these inside sales tools or field sales tools. It's just that we've never bothered to unlock the data that's sitting in those silos. But now we're going to do that, and very, very quickly, this is all testable. This isn't a hypothesis. You can get from what I believe based on our research, most sales leadership today has about a 30% view of the reality of the pipeline. You can get to almost 80% grip off the pipeline by using the minimum viable data set from just the two most popular locked data sets, one of which is your corporate email system. Everybody has that.
Right.
And your meeting system, which whether you're just looking at the calendar meeting information, which is also part of the corporate email system, you can do that. In some of our research, we've seen that if you bring in data from your web conferencing system, all of it is accessible via an API. You can then get to close to 90% accuracy.
Right. No, that's great. So we actually have a great question coming from Cam in the audience. So I'm going to interrupt the flow and ask this question, which is, why is it that you believe information asymmetry is a problem? My thinking, Cam's thinking, as management, I'm not actually concerned about the details of every deal, but more concerned about the overall trends of many deals. Doesn't information asymmetry serve that well?
So let me quickly read.
And I can read it again. It's a little long. Let me read it again for you. So why is it that you believe information asymmetry is a problem? My thinking is, as management, I'm not actually concerned about the details of every deal, but more concerned about the overall trends of many deals. Doesn't information asymmetry serve that well?
Cam's assessment of sales management typically cares about aggregates. It's absolutely true, and I agree with that as well, because as a sales manager, you have 10 to 12 reps you have to take care of, not just your own individual quota. Information asymmetry, even when you want to understand, and I'll talk about this in some more detail in a few slides here as well, in order to truly understand the aggregates, you actually need the full picture view of what has really happened. The less you know about every deal, even if you aggregate it all up, it's not going to fill in the gaps for you. You will still be left with a picture that's unreliable and incomplete. So information asymmetry will actually address this aggregate perspective of find me the patterns that are hidden across the aggregates, wins and losses that we've had in the past fiscal quarter, past fiscal year. And I'll come back, I'll revisit this in a few minutes to talk more about this.
Sure. I have another question from Elizabeth, which is, what's the best way to organize your minimum viable data set if the team is not using a CRM? Which, Elizabeth, you might need a CRM. It's 2017, but I'm sure that's a different webinar. So
I'll answer this question with an assumption that I wonder if Elizabeth meant that they don't have a CRM system at her company, or she meant that they have it, but the team just doesn't use it. And so in either of those two scenarios, there must be other tools that the sales team is using, whether it's email, whether it's the web conferencing system, whether it's the phone system. There are about 4 or so tools in general that we've noticed. Most companies have about 4 sales tools that they must use, they definitely use. And so even if there's not much in CRM, or you don't have a CRM system, you can still create your minimum viable data set based on the other 2 or 3 that the sales team has to use in order to conduct their day-to-day business.
Great. That's fantastic. Okay. So let's jump back in, and thank you, Elizabeth and Cam, for your questions. We appreciate it. Keep them coming. We love getting questions from the audience. So let's go back to where we were in the presentation. Great.
So once you've created a minimum viable data set, and again, this is more about identifying the minimum viable data set that is already existing inside of your company. This is something I want to just emphasize one more time, because I, as a sales rep, have myself been subjected to this, that please don't do anything that involves more work, more manual labor for your sales reps. They already have enough on their plates. This is the least of what they need. And the minimum viable data set already exists. You just have to open your eyes to it and start tapping it. But the question is that, okay, now that you have it, for a moment, let's assume that, what do you do next? And
Right.
so the next piece is you need to embrace a few modern metrics in order to truly utilize this minimum viable data set that now you're exposed to. And I'll share examples of 4 of my favorite ones. There's a bunch of others that we talk about, that we've written about, and there may be a few that are very specific to your company that you now will be able to measure having access to this new data set that we just talked about. So here are 4 that I have really started liking because they are very practical. In fact, we use them on ourselves to quite an extent as well, in addition to helping our customers use those. The first one, I'll quickly go through these, give you quick definitions of these. So the first one, I call it the visible to invisible pipeline ratio. And one of the questions that usually pops up is like, what the heck is a visible to invisible pipeline ratio? Means we've always thought about pipeline as what's in CRM is the pipeline. And so one of the things that in the past 1.5 years, based on some of our research we found, is that at most companies, there's a visible pipeline and there's an invisible pipeline. And the invisible pipeline is what the salespeople are working on, and that has not yet made it to the CRM system. I have myself been surprised by the numbers and the variance there. At some companies we've worked with, the number is as large as 70%, that 70% of accounts or opportunities are actually in the invisible pipeline as opposed to the visible pipeline. But here's a metric.
So Piyush, let me just interrupt. So what you're talking about is all the stuff the reps are sandbagging, right? The stuff they don't want to put in the pipeline because then they don't want to be held accountable to it. That's not making it past stage 1 or whatever however you're qualifying your deals. So you're talking about all that stuff that's quote unquote perhaps pre-qualified that you're not necessarily seeing in the pipeline, but you know there are conversations existing, right?
That's right, exactly.
Right.
So
okay.
I wouldn't necessarily call it sandbagging because I have been a seller myself for many years, and you know, a lot of times we as sellers, we just don't know, like, when will the deal close? And so it's not that sellers have bad intentions, they themselves just don't know. And
I'll speak on behalf of the other sellers and the other sales leaders. I have to say, yeah, we do know. We don't necessarily know. We don't know when it's going to close, but we have enough information to know whether or not it's qualified, right? Whether or not it's even worthy of our conversation. And I've seen too many reps, you know, not updating the CRM. Like, CRM engagement is huge. And for me, the way I'm interpreting this isn't so much like, hey, let's find this invisible pipeline where reps aren't doing their job, you know, the right way. That's not the goal. We're not trying to catch people doing something wrong. What we really want to do is just, as you said, create visibility to what the real pipeline looks like, and even make it easier for the reps so they don't have to do all this stuff manually and click. As you said earlier, my 1 clicks is now 7 clicks, right? Let's get that out of their way so that they can actually do the job they were paid to do, which is have good conversations, move those conversations forward, and close a deal, not data entry. So I get where you're going with this one.
Right, very much so. And the reason behind this metric is that if you don't have a metric like this, then the anxiety that it causes in the minds of sales managers, which is, are my team members working hard or not? And it's, you know, this is something that I've myself experienced, where a lot of sales management will not stand up on stage and admit this, but in a personal one-on-one conversation, a lot of sales managers have a few people on their team that they are worried about. Are these people working hard or not? And so having certain metrics and the transparency associated with that, I think it will just reduce the consumption of headache and heartache medicines in our society.
Yep. No, that's great. So one of the questions that just came in that I want to ask real quick before we move forward is, would this be better attributed to more of a systemic issue in regards to expectation within the specific org? I think the question is sort of determining this visible versus invisible pipeline, right? Is it something that could be the culture, or is it truly something that's org related? And I think I'll jump in and answer this one quickly because I know we want to move on. I want to be conscious of time, which is, William, it probably depends. It probably goes both ways depending on the organization you're working with. So, but let's go ahead to the next one, which I know is a fun one to talk about too.
Right, so let's talk about the second metric, which is called, I call it the account heartbeat. And in the world of marketing, so we borrowed this metric from actually the world of marketing, where recency and frequency of customer touch, that metric has actually existed for probably 20 years. In the B2B world, it hasn't quite been around, it hasn't existed, and primarily because it has been so difficult to feed the data in to calculate a metric like this. And so once you have your minimum viable data set about what the reality is in terms of what your sales team is doing with the outside world, it's pretty easy to calculate a metric like this and have it accessible to everybody in the organization, so that you know if you have certain priority accounts, strategic accounts, whether or not they are immediate opportunities this fiscal quarter or not, there is a measure of what this heartbeat looks like of that account in our eyes. The third one, I call it the committee score. As a lot of us have experienced, there's a lot of good market research on the topic of the world of B2B buying has changed. There's between 5 to 7 buyers involved. It's not just one decision maker. It's a committee that's buying your products. And so based on that, we call it the committee score, which basically is a simple metric which measures how many people in the buying committee are we engaged with. And again, the trick here is not to ask salespeople to make lengthy lists of everybody they've ever spoken with and enter that in the CRM system, because they just never will, but using your minimum viable data set to answer this metric and auto-populate it. That is what I want to emphasize here.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think I remember us talking about this one yesterday, because we know that the average deal, particularly in the SaaS world, I think we're hearing now it's 6 point something people, right? Used to be 4 point, then 4.2, and then it was 5.3, and now it's 6 point whatever. And new people get added to this all the time. And so the faster you have that information available absolutely helps that score. So I think that's an easy one in theory to get. Hopefully it's happening via email where people are being added, to the email threads. So, but that's really great.
And the last one here is the seller prospecting efficiency. And this is basically a measure of how good your individual sellers are on a monthly level at connecting with new prospects. This one I feel is important, not just because you want to measure reps, but because you actually want to help reps. There are some reps who are really good at nurturing customers and closing deals. They may not be very good at cold emailing people or stalking people on LinkedIn. And this is also a metric where management as well as marketing can have a role to play, that, here are the reps who are not doing as well on this metric. Let's proactively help them.
So that's your dials and talk time kind of stuff, right? Your email open rate and response rate. Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about as it relates to the filling the funnel portion of things?
To some extent, yes. It's a level simpler than that, again, based on if you don't have a fancy tool that's tracking close rates and such, you can still, as part of your minimum viable data set, track very, very elementary but interesting statistics, like how many new individuals has a sales rep started engaging with in the last fiscal month.
Okay, so you're even going before that. You're just looking for that high level piece. Oh, that's great. I've never thought about that one. So, so how do you put all this together, right? These are your 4 pieces. So how do we take all of this and then wrap it back to even comparing this to maybe your closed won deals or your closed lost deals or your close ratio? What do you do next with this data?
So once you've put together your minimum viable data set, you've created some metrics or borrowed some metrics that you want to use. These 4 could be those. So the next step really becomes quantitatively identifying win-loss recipes. And I think this is related to the question I believe Cam asked earlier in the webinar as to, so, how do you understand your complicated world of B2B sales at an aggregate level? Typically what has happened, and I'll raise my hand because I've been guilty of doing this myself, is at most companies, win-loss analysis basically means an interview, whether it's an email interview or a phone interview or a semi-annual survey that is done of the sales team, and that survey or interview then becomes a win-loss report. And it's very, very subjective and qualitative, but that's what has happened primarily because there wasn't a way to do it any better than that. Once you have a minimum viable data set, you have all or 90% of the data to begin answering questions at an aggregate level, because that is what you need from a longer-term decision-making perspective. And these are some real examples of things that we've done. You can do this. Answering questions like, or identifying patterns like, of all the wins we've had in the past 12 fiscal months, what was the committee score? How many number of people were involved on the buying side in every win or every loss? This is a question you can very easily answer once you have the data set and you have the metrics. There are other patterns you can then start identifying from the data set. An example could be if we sent this particular document, whether it's a conditions of satisfaction document, use case document, if it was sent in the first 30 days, the likelihood of our deal closing is 95%. If we had 11 touches over the 3 months before an opportunity was entered in the CRM system, we have a much higher likelihood of winning or losing, whatever the case may be. Another one, I've seen a lot of my friends in the sales operations community talk about opportunity age, where you can run a report today in your salesforce.com instance, which will give you all the opportunities that are above a particular age. But then the question is, what do you do with that? Do you just throw them out of the pipeline? Do you scold your salespeople? I would ask people, instead of just looking at the metric at that level, dig deeper into it with this minimum viable data set, begin answering questions as to, is the opportunity age correlated with certain other actions that have or have not happened, whether on our side, whether on the customer side. Yep. Begin to question the opportunity age as opposed to just looking at it and then discarding opportunities. And then there are a few others that you can very easily start gleaning patterns like, how many number of in-person meetings does it take to win a deal? Do in-person meetings even influence the outcome of a deal? You kind of have that data at your disposal now. And then lastly, a lot of companies, they spend a lot of money acquiring analyst reports, subscribing to literature from industry experts and such to help the sales team. Are those assets helping the sales team? Are they even helping close deals? The only way to really find that out is a quantitative analysis, because if you interview a rep, at least from my experience, every time I was interviewed after a win or a loss, I never bothered to even remember which documents helped me close a deal. But that's the way to really do a quantitative analysis and identify patterns.
So this is great, Piyush. This is really, really fascinating. Couple of questions that I think I have, and they're coming from the audience as well. And this is from Cam again, which is, we talk about all this data being in separate silos, and trying to get them all together to, coordinate them. But in theory, shouldn't that data already be in the CRM, and can't the CRM already run some of this analysis, right? And I don't want to turn this into a pitch, because I know that's what this could sound like. That's not our goal. Our goal is to say, well, why isn't the CRM already doing this for us?
Right. So at a very elementary level, you can accomplish some of this. I think some of the practitioners that I've been inspired with, they've been doing some of this, kind of hacking their CRM systems. If you can hack your CRM system, and then it becomes a function of what are your own technical chops and how much support can you get from your own IT department. It becomes a lot of that, but there are ways to hack your internal systems and make this happen. So you can do that if you have the skills and the audacity to some extent.
So and let's talk about that a little bit more too, because this sounds really good. Look, if you're working at Microsoft or a larger company that has 10 or 15 sales reps and you do have a sales ops person, right? This may be something you want to tackle. What if you're not there yet? Maybe you do even have a sales ops person, and you're like, wow, this stuff that Piyush is talking about is fascinating. Where do you even start, right? And it's not about coming in and getting SalesTing as a service, but where do I even start to just understand what I have and get some baselines?
So I think one of the first steps to do really is you can identify, or at least attempt to identify, what's the lowest common denominator across my sales organization in terms of here is something, or here are the 2 or 3 things that everybody has to do in order to get the job done. And this could be as simple as, well, they have to use their Office 365 or Gmail account to communicate with clients. They have to use GoToMeeting to host web conferences. Whatever that is, identify the lowest common denominator that is true in your organization. That's the place to begin. The other place to also look into very early on is, do you have a delta between reality and what your pipeline reports and pictures indicate today? Is this a problem worth solving? That's the other problem to think about.
And what would that delta need to be, right? Like, so I've been a sales manager, and I got pretty good at mine. Now, granted, I was doing it all by hand, but I always sort of knew each week, for lack of a better word, deal by deal, what was going on. And my accuracy would always improve, right? So how far apart does your delta need to be between your forecast and you're actually hitting the number? Like, is it big misses? And again, even a different way, how I look at my forecast in July is going to be very different than how I look at it at the beginning of September, because I'll have more data. What's that delta need to look like? How do you know it's like, oh, you should start doing this because your delta's so far apart? What's that number in your mind?
So I can't give you a fixed number because the answer is it depends. I think it really depends on your appetite for risk, among other things. For some sales managers and sales ops teams, they are willing to live on the edge, and if they miss, it's okay for them. The sky won't fall. Whereas for others, they are driving towards perfection to some extent, where they do not want to face the situation of having missed their number and want to proactively address it. The other interesting kind of reality of life that influences this is also there's actually a lot of turnover in the world of sales. This is something we've noticed at the sales rep level as well as sales manager level. I have some statistics I can share as a follow-up, but because of the rapid pace of change that's happening on the personnel side, that introduces another level of complexity where just when you feel like you're getting very comfortable in terms of understanding everybody in your team and understanding their way of working and their forecasting abilities, 1 or 2 people are probably in the market for a new job. And so just when you have it all figured out, something happens and the rug is pulled from under your feet all over again.
How many iterations of your pipeline do you need to go through? Like, the one thing I know about forecasting is that the goal, if you're going to make improving your forecast better, is that, let's say you're on a quarterly sales cycle, right? It's going to take 3 or 4 quarters. It's going to take a year to constantly see how much better you're getting. It's not something you can solve overnight in theory. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying, well, gosh, actually, no, if you use this sort of minimal viable data, that no, you actually you can improve your forecast that much more quickly. What used to take 4 quarters might take only 2, which is really valuable, right? That's a huge 6 months in terms of revenue.
Right. So our thinking on this is that waiting for 4 quarters to see results might be eternity. And so once you have a grip on this minimum viable data set, some of the things you can start doing is, in the world of data science, we do this all the time. Every time we come up with a new model, we test it with the past.
Right.
And so you can actually run some simulations on past data and validate your model to see the lift that you're likely going to get if you had this in place 2 quarters back. So that way you're decreasing the uncertainty associated with these new models and metrics that you might introduce.
Sure. So I'm going to ask a totally off-the-wall question, one that we didn't even talk about, which is, how would you know if you're even capable as a sales leader or your sales ops team to even be good at doing this data analysis, right? Like, it's one thing to get the data, right? And we spend hours upon hours getting the data, and then we're so exhausted we barely even look time to analyze it. Is this something that's not as hard as people think it is? Is this like, oh my, you even said the word data science, right? It's like, oh my God, I'm not a data scientist, I'm a sales guy, right? Could even Richard Harris learn to do this? Like, maybe that's the best question to ask.
That's right, and I think a lot of, so here's the surprising fact that we found. Most people who are in the role of sales operations, so these are kind of quantitative people because they are living their lives in spreadsheets and reports. More than 70% of people in the role of sales ops do not have a statistics or mathematics or science background or education at all. So the skills are, it's more aptitude than your ability to write queries and code. Okay. The other shortcut here really is embracing a few metrics which are simple to understand, which everybody can agree on that here are the metrics. And once you have the metrics in place, then measuring the team and feeding into those metrics actually becomes kind of a process on autopilot. So you're not becoming a data scientist, creating brand new metrics and writing new queries every month. You embrace the metrics that make sense for your business and then set up some autopilot rules, if you will.
So, and I just to clarify, you're even saying, look, keep it really simple to start. Find 2 metrics. Start to collect the data over time. See what you can learn from it. If you learn nothing, then you've at least learned that those 2 metrics aren't the right ones, and you should add a 3rd and a 4th. Is that what I'm hearing you say? Like, don't try and get all these pieces all together unless you have that kind of bandwidth. To start, just choose 2 and see what you discover so that you can get yourself into this mindset. Is that a good understanding of what you're saying?
Very much so. There are no exact recipes here because, among other things, every B2B company is different. Yeah. And so there's not that, hey, you have to have these 13 metrics in order to do a good job of sales management and ops. Some companies need 4 and some companies need 9. And everyone has their own path. You kind of have to find the recipes that work for you. One other ask and almost challenge I have for a lot of attendees here is, of the metrics that you have, what if tomorrow you reduce that by 10%? Just get rid of 10% of your metrics. Will that significantly alter any business outcomes? And if the answer is no, then you're already overspending time and energy on metrics that are not going to move the needle.
Got it. That's great. Well, let's go ahead and sort of wrap this up. Thank you. This was a fascinating one. I was really glad I kind of got to sit through this session twice, so I got a lot more out of it today than I did the other day when we were doing the planning. So thank you so much. Where do you sort of feel like we should be going next with this? I know this all this data goes back to sales and marketing. So where do you want to take us as we start to wrap up this session? So
as we begin to wrap up, I want to also touch upon the marketing piece very briefly, at least, because one of the things that a lot of marketers, their pet peeve typically is that sales just doesn't give us enough data. They never enter enough in CRM system, and so our hands are tied in terms of what we can do for the sales team. And now that most of you have sat through us for the past 35, 40 minutes, and you have a sense of, if we have this minimum viable data set, marketing is another stakeholder that can benefit from it, so that way they have a better understanding of where the sales team needs help. I think every single marketing dollar needs to be held accountable to the pipeline, and this approach brings that level of transparency and accountability that will serve both the sides. There's a lot of talk about account-based marketing going on, but account-based marketing will not realize its full potential unless the sales team cooperates. And this is one recipe for cooperation between marketing and their ABM strategies and the sales team. So that's something, because I've personally, in my own sales career, there have been times where I felt that I was kind of lonely. I was responsible for lead gen and prospecting and closing opportunities and keeping existing customers happy. I could have done better had I gotten some more help from my marketing. And so that's why I very humbly ask if there are any marketers listening to this message that please proactively get more involved, because the sales team needs your help.
That's great. No, I agree, and we're starting to see this merger, right? And I think even the CRO role that's now starting to become more proficient across the sales world is driving this too.
Right, and so as we begin to wrap up the session and maybe take some more questions if there are some, I on my side kind of want to conclude with this beautiful quote I read some time back, which is, "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion."
Yeah, I think that's great.
It applies to sellers, it applies to sales management, it applies to everybody, that no matter how good your opinions are, if you cannot back them up with data, they're just opinions.
No, that's great. Do you remember who said that? That's a great quote. I love it.
I don't. It's not I'm not that smart to come up with a quote like this.
Me either. Well, that's great. So tell everybody real quick, do let people know a little bit more about what it is you guys do at SalesTing, and certainly obviously how they can get a hold of you if they do have additional questions or want to learn more about what you're doing.
Sure. So here's my contact information. My name's complicated, so I kept my email address very, very simple. And we have a special web page we put up just for this webinar as well. So you could go there, and there's a form you can fill up. If you have any questions, if you want to get in touch with us, we have a pipeline grader. It's a semi-autonomous tool that kind of helps you understand the delta, basically answering the question, is this problem worth solving, before you try and solve it. And so if you want some more information on that, please fill out a form, and then somebody on my team will get back in touch with you to see if it's the right fit for you or not. But this is a lot of what we do. In addition to being a product company, we are helping the community understand this problem and look at it slightly differently. So it's not just about, hey, you have to buy our product. A lot of our metrics that we talk about, they're kind of open source, if you will. So we're more than happy to share things that you can just use on your own without necessarily buying a product.
That's great. That's really, that is very kind of you, Piyush. So for someone in the community, thank you for doing that. I've got a question coming in from Christopher, which is, how do you start to get the sales and marketing cross-functional alignment? Do you start with systems under one umbrella? And again, that's probably a whole webinar or three in and of itself, but what's your opinion from the sales team perspective of getting this greater alignment between sales and marketing?
So that's a great question, and I'll admit before I answer the question that I'm kind of biased in terms of revenue and pipeline. So the best way to begin to align the two sides together, I think, is to look at the pipeline, look at the minimum viable data set from the sales team's perspective, and then help marketing focus on that. as opposed to digging into all the marketing systems. Marketing typically has benefited from being a little ahead of the curve. They have
Yes.
access to more data sets than we on the sales and pipeline side have. So I would bring this into the picture and begin the conversation there to kind of get a bigger bang for buck, if you will,
Yep.
than just looking at top of the funnel marketing data sets that have been around for some time.
Yep. No, I think that's great. Well, thank you so much. Let's see. Another question's coming in. We've got a couple of minutes. What if you're both marketing and sales? And Rashida, I don't necessarily understand the context, but maybe Piyush does. If you are running marketing and sales, where do you start? Maybe that's the question she's asking.
Right. So I think, if you're running both marketing and sales, then you're already a step ahead of many other companies where marketing and sales are themselves siloed. And so a couple meetings have to happen before people can even agree on a common approach. So you're one step ahead of that. And in which case, the first step really is you can begin directly identifying the metrics that are most likely to move the needle in your case, and go from there, as opposed to those where marketing and sales themselves are siloed and you need to find a time on everyone's calendar to even get people to agree on this approach. You can make the call that this is the approach that makes sense for us. Let's go to step 2, which is identifying the metrics that we are going to embrace.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting, and I know we don't have time for this one, but it would be very interesting to see sort of, okay, so we now know the minimum data set from the sales side. What would be the minimum data set from the marketing side, and how do you align those? And granted, that's probably like phase 2 of your kind of a project, right? Because at some point, what does the white paper download look like? What does the PPC do? What does the SEO do? Which blog posts can eventually all be wrapped into that, which, unless you're saying, well, actually, Richard, no, that's too much data. What we're saying is we don't want that much data. Let's keep it simple with what happens in the sales conversations.
Right. So I think it's a multi-phase approach where level 1 really is making a beginning from perhaps the sales side. Look at this from the sales and pipeline perspective first, and then level 2 is when you bring in the additional marketing data sets. The good news is most of the marketing data sets are already there. There's very little work that needs to be done to unlock marketing data. You might have to do some work to correlate it with the relevant sales data sets. And so that might become part of level 2 or phase 2 of this journey.
Great. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you. I know we got, we'll give everybody 6 minutes for a quick bite for lunch if you're on the West Coast, or a bio break if you're on the East Coast. But thank you so much, Piyush, for doing this and sharing this knowledge. It really is sort of, very much opened my mind to a different way of seeing the pipeline and trying to approach this in a very systematic and smart way. So Piyush, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this with us.
Richard, thanks for hosting, and everybody on the webinar. Thank you for your time. It's valuable. You spent almost an hour with us. I appreciate it. And please do send me your comments, whether you liked, whether you agreed, or whether you perhaps disagreed with some of our perspectives. I would very much love to hear your feedback.
That's great. Awesome. Well, thanks again. And thank you again to everybody for joining us. We hope you guys have a great week and finish your quarter strong. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.